So let's go into now a couple other just kind of fascinating facets of stress. So one is there are some gender differences. One of the key kind of phrases you might hear, because psychologists always love to rhyme things, fight or flight, rest or digest. So this is tend and befriend. But this is a response that is characterized by soothing, so tending to something, and building social connections, so befriending something. And this response is a stress response that's more typical for females. So women are actually more likely to tend and befriend in response to stressors than men are. So maybe an evolutionary kind of perspective to this might be that mothers with small children probably wouldn't be very good at fighting or flighting to a particular stressor. So they might be more in control of soothing the frightened child or hiding, or maybe forming some sort of social alliance to further protection. So these are strategies that maybe the mother is better equipped to kind of use. And so one of the other key things I want to point out here is that it involves the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone that is commonly called the cuddle hormone because it's released when you hug someone. It's a hormone that's related to social bonding. So this whole kind of tend and befriend, when you're befriending and creating these social connections, it's releasing a lot of oxytocin instead. So now we've talked about a couple different hormones. We've talked about the epinephrine, we've talked about cortisol, and this is oxytocin. So oxytocin is your cuddle social bonding hormone. Okay, so lastly, we're going to talk about socioeconomic status. And I'm not entirely clear why this is under the biological section, but this is where your book places it. So we're going to talk about socioeconomic status here. As might not be shocking, people from low socioeconomic status backgrounds have a lot more stressors. So there's a lot more noise and toxins in the environment. They might experience a lot more violence, either in their communities or in their homes. They have access to fewer resources, fewer schooling, fewer healthcare, fewer just resources in general. And the healthcare they receive, the physical healthcare, isn't as available or abundant or accessible to them because of finances per se. So research has suggested that different health disparities in children from low socioeconomic status tends to persist across the lifespan. So this kind of stress affects you as you move forward in your life, and actually has been shown to accelerate the aging process. So in essence, leading to an earlier death. And the reason this happens, again, this is not a genetics course, but just fun fact, your chromosomes, so your genes that are all wound up into chromosomes, have things called telomeres at the end of them. And every time your chromosomes replicate, those telomeres get a little bit shorter. And once the telomeres are gone, that cell can't replicate anymore, leading to like that cell death. So if stress is shortening your telomeres, it's then accelerating and leading to that cell death quicker. I may not have explained that perfectly if you're a geneticist and you're like, no, those words weren't right. But overall, just kind of know that it accelerates the aging process. And one way you can see this, as with President Obama or different presidents in general, they're not, low socioeconomic status per se, but looking at presidents from, the beginning of their term to the end of their term, so President Obama served 8 years, it's a nice way to kind of highlight. You can see that, you could tell in his hair, in his face, that he has experienced a lot of stressful events as president of the United States. So this kind of accentuates the aging process and how stress can accelerate aging. This is the last thing we're going to talk about here, and that is epigenetics. So if you remember back to our developmental lecture, we talked about epi, meaning like above or extra, above the genes. So this occurs when your environment is influencing your genes, either like whether it's expressed or when it's expressed. And the key thing here is that, again, if you have severe stress early in life, it's going to lead to lasting changes. So it can lead to things like increased HPA axis responses to stress. So more of that, like release of cortisol kind of hormones, which we've just talked about in, too high of quantity is bad. It leads to things like reduced hippocampus volume, which again leads to problems, for instance, like its susceptibility to PTSD we talked about. It also could lead to things like increased amygdala activity to threatful stimuli, another key component of PTSD. Which also kind of, if you just take a second, think about it, it makes sense in light of experiencing traumatic events like occurs in PTSD can lead to these lasting stressful kind of changes. And it tends to, this idea of epigenetics, that we have certain genes that are determining, what things are expressed or not. It explains why some people might be more vulnerable to stress. Perhaps they have a particular gene or a part of their chromosome that's controlling a certain stress response or stress behavior. So, for instance, depression has been linked to a gene that regulates serotonin function. And there are two different forms of that gene. So if you have one form, you may be less vulnerable to stressors and depression. But if you have the other form, you may be more vulnerable to stressors and depression. So genes and environment interact to determine stress responses.